I was 34 years old when this happened, and I worked as a sales representative for a small agricultural equipment company in Jackson, Mississippi. My job basically consisted of spending the day driving from one property to another, talking with farmers, owners of small rural plots, and people who needed parts, pumps, tools, or maintenance for machinery. I had been doing that for almost 6 years, so I was used to bad roads, weak cell service, and houses located 20 or 30 minutes from the nearest highway. That Thursday, I had left home early to visit a few clients in the southern part of the state, near small communities between Macomb and Brookhaven. It was late autumn, so it got dark early, and the air became pretty cold after 6 in the evening. I remember spending the entire day getting in and out of the company pickup truck, with the smell of stale coffee in the cup holder, paperwork scattered across the passenger seat, and that fine layer of rural road dust sticking to the dashboard. I was tired, but not enough to be concerned. I just wanted to finish the last visit and get back to Jackson before it got too late. The problem started because I trusted the GPS too much, and a shortcut I thought I knew. The last property was at the end of a dirt road, more isolated than I had expected. The client was an older man named Ray, who owned a small farm, and I stayed there longer than planned because he wanted to compare prices, talk about financing, and show me a water pump that was having problems near a shed. By the time I finally got back into the pickup truck, it was truly dark. Not that blue, late evening darkness, but actual night, with a black sky, no visible moon, and only the porch light of his house growing smaller in my rearview mirror. I entered my home address into the GPS, but the main route required me to backtrack almost 20 minutes along the same road to reach a state highway. The app showed a gravel road cutting through the area and saving about 15 minutes. I had taken roads like that many times before, so I didn't think much about it. The radio was playing quietly, some country station filled with static. The heater hummed steadily, and the tires made a dry crunching sound against the gravel. The road was narrow, with fields on both sides and old wooden fences appearing only when my headlights caught them. After about 10 minutes of driving, I realized I hadn't seen a single house, utility pole, or another vehicle. That was when I started feeling that discomfort that comes when you realize you're more isolated than you thought. My cell signal had disappeared completely several minutes earlier. I even picked up my phone to check, but it only displayed no service. That wasn't unusual in that area, so I tried not to think too much about it. I kept driving while watching both sides of the road. The fields seemed endless. In some stretches, I could see dark silhouettes that might have been barns, trees, or abandoned farming equipment. It was hard to tell. The only light came from my own headlights. Everything else was complete darkness. I remember slowing down because the road was becoming rougher. There were potholes, larger rocks, and a few sections where the gravel looked freshly spread. Then I rounded a gentle curve to the right and saw something stopped ahead. At first I thought it was a tractor or some equipment left near the road, but as I got closer I realized it was an old truck. One of those large work models, rusty, with a long cargo bed. The problem was that it wasn't parked on the shoulder. It was positioned sideways, blocking almost the entire width of the road. I slowed to a complete stop about 20 meters away. I sat there for a few seconds, expecting someone to step out of the cab or switch on a flashlight. Nothing happened. The engine of my pickup remained running, and I could hear the steady hum of the interior fan mixed with the faint ticking sounds from the dashboard. I flashed my headlights a few times to get the attention of whoever might be there. No response. I grabbed a small flashlight from the center console and shined it through the windshield, but the distance and the truck's position made it difficult to see much. The cab appeared empty. The windows were too dark for me to be certain. My first thought was that some farmer had left the vehicle there because of a mechanical problem, but the longer I looked at it, the less sense that explanation made. There were no hazard lights on, no traffic cones, no one working nearby. Most importantly, there wasn't enough room to drive around it. The fences on both sides came almost right up to the road. I sat there for nearly a minute trying to decide what to do. Eventually, I decided to put the truck in reverse and back up until I found a place where I could turn around. That was exactly when things started to feel very wrong. As soon as I started backing up, I glanced into the driver's side mirror out of habit and noticed a faint light appearing far out in the field. At first, I thought it was a flashlight carried by some farm worker. The light appeared and disappeared as it moved over small rises in the terrain. Then a second light appeared on the opposite side of the road. Then a third. I stopped immediately. I stared, trying to understand what I was seeing. The lights weren't close together. They were spread out as if several people were walking through the fields toward the road. My first instinct was to look for a normal explanation. Maybe there was a problem with the truck and those people were coming to help. But something didn't feel right. None of them pointed their flashlights at the ground. The lights remained at chest height most of the time, aimed straight ahead, and all of them were approaching slowly. Very slowly. I turned the radio volume down almost all the way and kept watching. My heart started racing when I realized none of the flashlights seemed to be coming from the direction of a house, a barn, or any visible structure. They were simply emerging from the darkness of the fields. That was the moment I decided I didn't want to find out what was going on. I shifted into reverse again and pressed harder on the accelerator. The pickup began backing down the gravel road, bouncing over the potholes. My eyes moved constantly between the mirrors and the road behind me. I hadn't gone more than about 100 meters when I saw something that made my stomach drop. Another light appeared directly behind the truck, not very far away, maybe 50 meters. It was a single flashlight pointed straight at me. The person holding it was standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes immediately. At that moment, I realized something that still bothers me when I think about it. None of those people were shouting. No one was waving. No one seemed to need help. There wasn't a single voice, just the sound of my engine running and the wind moving across the fields. I was trapped between the truck blocking the road ahead and someone blocking the way I had come. I looked to both sides again and saw the other flashlights continuing to move slowly closer. For the first time that night, I felt real fear, the kind that makes your hands cold even while gripping the steering wheel. I tried to think rationally. Maybe it was a group of landowners searching for someone. Maybe there had been an accident nearby. Maybe I was interpreting everything incorrectly because I was alone and exhausted. But the more I watched, the less those explanations made sense. I grabbed my phone again out of pure reflex. Still no signal. I tried calling 911 anyway because I had heard that emergency calls can sometimes connect where normal calls cannot. The call never even started. The screen spent a few seconds attempting to connect before returning to the home screen. When I looked up again, I realized the flashlights were significantly closer. I still couldn't make out faces, but I could clearly see human silhouettes now. There were at least 4 people in the fields to my left, and maybe 3 or 4 on the right. What frightened me most was the way they moved. They didn't run. They didn't shout. They showed no urgency. They simply kept walking toward me as if they were absolutely certain I had nowhere to go. That was when I had a desperate idea. The fence on my right side seemed slightly farther from the road than the one on the left. I switched on the high beams and tried to assess the terrain. There appeared to be a narrow strip of grass between the gravel and the fence. It wasn't wide enough to pass normally, but maybe I could force the pickup through a weaker section of the wood. I knew I might destroy part of the fence and possibly damage the company vehicle. But at that moment, it seemed like a minor concern. While I was evaluating the situation, one of the flashlights shined directly through my windshield for a few seconds. The beam hit my eyes and forced me to turn my head away. When I looked back, I finally got a clearer view of one of the people. It was a man. At least, he appeared to be. He was wearing a dark cap and a heavy jacket. What chilled me wasn't his appearance. It was the fact that he was staring directly at me without showing any reaction. No gesture, no words, just watching. At that instant, I stopped searching for explanations and decided to get out of there no matter what it cost. I jerked the steering wheel sharply to the right and slammed my foot onto the accelerator. The pickup left the gravel with such a violent jolt that my head hit the seat back. The tires spun on the wet grass, throwing dirt and rocks behind me. For a second, I thought the truck was going to get stuck, but it kept moving forward. The fence appeared in the headlights, and I heard the sound of wood breaking as I smashed through the first posts. The impact shook everything inside the cab. My document case fell onto the floor. Some tools slid behind the seat, and the dashboard alarm started beeping because of some temporary malfunction. I kept accelerating without looking back. The terrain was uneven, and the pickup bounced violently as it crossed the field. I had no idea where I was going. I only wanted as much distance as possible between myself and those people. When I finally glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw several flashlights running now. It was the first time I had seen anyone run that night. The lights moved rapidly toward the place where I had broken through the fence. That confirmed to me that I had made the right decision. For several minutes, I drove almost blindly across the field. The headlights illuminated only short stretches ahead, revealing holes, tall vegetation, and patches of muddy ground. I was afraid of hitting a ditch or rolling the truck. My breathing was so rapid that I began feeling intense pressure in my chest. I remember constantly looking behind me, expecting to see those flashlights appear again. At one point, I spotted a line of trees and headed toward it because there seemed to be a maintenance trail running between them. When I reached the trail, I found something that gave me a little hope. Fresh tire tracks. Someone used that route regularly. I followed the tracks, and after a few minutes that felt like an entire hour, I spotted a paved road. The moment the tires touched asphalt, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I continued driving without slowing down. A few minutes later, my cell signal returned. I immediately pulled onto the shoulder, locked the doors, called 911, and explained everything that had just happened. The dispatcher listened carefully and asked for my location. I explained that I didn't know exactly where I had left the gravel road because I had crossed an entire field to escape. She stayed on the line while a patrol unit was sent to the area. About 20 minutes later, 2 officers found me stopped near an intersection. I was shaking so badly that I could barely hold my phone. I told them everything I had seen. One officer seemed to believe I was genuinely frightened, but both exchanged looks when I mentioned the flashlights emerging from the fields. Even so, they decided to investigate. I followed them from a safe distance. It took a while to locate the gravel road again. When we arrived at the spot where I had seen the truck, there was absolutely nothing there. No truck, no people, no flashlights. The road was completely empty. The officers searched part of the area using the patrol car's spotlights, but they found no clear evidence besides some tire tracks and the section of fence I had destroyed while crossing the field. One of them commented that someone might have been trying to scare drivers or set up some kind of robbery, but there wasn't enough evidence to reach any conclusion. I returned home close to dawn. I couldn't sleep. I spent hours replaying everything in my head and trying to find a logical explanation that fit all the details. What still bothers me most isn't the truck blocking the road. It isn't even the flashlights, it's the way those people behaved. If it was an ordinary robbery attempt, why didn't anyone say anything? Why did they keep approaching so slowly? Why did someone block both ends of the road before I even tried to leave? A few days later, I spoke with a farmer in the area during another business visit. When I mentioned the road, he fell silent for a few seconds and asked exactly which section I was talking about. Then he simply said that years earlier, there had been several robberies involving drivers in rural areas of that part of the county, and that he had avoided driving there at night ever since. He didn't go into details, and I didn't press him. This happened almost 3 years ago. Since that night, no matter how much time I might save, I never take shortcuts through unfamiliar rural roads after dark. Maybe those people only wanted to rob me. Maybe it was something organized and I managed to escape before something worse happened. The truth is, I never found out. And honestly, after that night, I don't think I want to. Story 2. I was 21 years old when this happened, and I was in my 3rd year of college in Knoxville, Tennessee. It was Thanksgiving weekend, and I had decided to drive alone to visit some relatives who lived near a small town in the eastern part of the state. I had made that trip before, but I usually traveled during the day. This time I left campus later because I needed to finish an assignment before hitting the road. By the time I finally left, it was already starting to get dark. My car was an old Honda Civic that I used for everything. Nothing fancy, but it had always been reliable. I put on a playlist, grabbed a coffee at a gas station before leaving town, and figured I would arrive at my aunt and uncle's house around 9 o'clock that night. Traffic was light, and most of the trip was completely normal. As I moved farther away from urban areas, the roads became narrower and were surrounded by farms, open fields, and small wooded areas. I was used to that kind of scenery because I had grown up in a relatively small town. At no point did I think I would have any problems. Everything started when the GPS recalculated my route after a state road was partially closed for maintenance. It sent me along a few secondary roads that I had never used before. At first, I wasn't worried. The app seemed to know exactly where it was taking me, but after nearly half an hour without passing any gas stations, stores, or any kind of illuminated place, I started to feel uneasy. My cell signal also began to fluctuate. Sometimes I had one bar, then it disappeared completely. I was still following the GPS instructions, but I noticed the map was taking longer to update. At one point, I reached a poorly marked fork in the road. There was an old sign partially reflecting my headlights, but it was tilted and covered in dirt. The GPS froze at that exact moment. The screen remained frozen for several seconds. I thought the correct turn was to the right, so I went that way. About 15 minutes later, I realized I had probably made a mistake. The road was becoming increasingly narrow. There were no houses, cars, or any signs of activity. When I tried reopening the navigation app, the signal had disappeared completely. I continued driving slowly while trying to decide what to do. The road seemed to cut through a huge agricultural area. Every now and then I passed wooden fences, distant silos, or empty fields illuminated only by my headlights. The temperature had dropped considerably, and a thin layer of fog was beginning to form near the ground in some places. I turned off the music to concentrate better, and kept watching for any sign that might indicate a town or a main road. Nothing appeared. The only sounds inside the car were the engine running and the tires humming over the uneven pavement. After a few more minutes, I spotted a yellowish light in the distance. At first, I thought it was a street light, but as I got closer, I realized it was coming from a porch. There was an old house set back a short distance from the road. It was the kind of house commonly seen in older rural areas of Tennessee, with 2 stories, light-colored siding weathered by time, and a covered front porch. The porch light was on and visible from far away. That brought me enormous relief. I thought I had finally found someone who could tell me how to get back to a main road. I parked near the gravel entrance to the property and spent a few seconds observing the house before getting out. I found it strange that I saw no other signs of activity. There was no television visible through the windows, no vehicle parked near the residence, and no sounds coming from inside. Even so, the porch light was on as if someone were awake. I checked my phone out of habit, but I still had no signal. So I got out of the car and walked toward the porch. The air was cold and damp. I could hear crickets and some kind of agricultural equipment operating far away, probably on another property. I climbed the wooden steps and knocked on the door several times. I waited. No response. I knocked again, this time a little harder. Still nothing. I even looked through one of the nearby windows to see if anyone was inside, but the curtains were closed. I stood there for perhaps a full minute without hearing absolutely anything. No footsteps, no voices, not even the sound of a television. The situation began to feel strange enough that I gave up on the idea and headed back to my car. As I walked down the porch steps and started back toward the car, I got that strange feeling that someone was watching me. At first, I tried to ignore it. I think everyone has felt that at some point. I was lost, it was nighttime, I was alone, and I was probably more nervous than I wanted to admit. Even so, just before opening the driver's door, I glanced back over my shoulder toward the house. That was when I froze. Someone was standing on the porch. I was absolutely certain the porch had been empty when I started walking down the steps. But now a figure was there, near the front door. The person hadn't made any noise. I hadn't heard the door open. I hadn't heard footsteps. I hadn't heard the porch boards creak. Nothing. They were simply there. The yellow light above the door illuminated only part of the figure, making details difficult to see. It appeared to be an adult man wearing dark clothing. What unsettled me wasn't his appearance, it was the fact that he didn't wave. He didn't say anything. He didn't seem surprised to see me. He simply stood motionless, staring directly in my direction. I stood beside the car for a few seconds trying to process what I was seeing. I considered calling out and asking for directions, but something about the situation made me far too uncomfortable. I quickly got into the car and locked the doors. As I inserted the key into the ignition, I looked back at the porch. The person was still standing in exactly the same spot, not moving, not speaking. The engine started immediately. I was already preparing to leave when something caught my attention in the right side mirror. There was movement behind the house. I turned my head and saw two other figures emerging from the rear of the property. At first I assumed they were residents returning home or relatives of the man, but I soon realized they were walking directly toward the road. Not toward the house, not toward the porch, toward the road. And the strangest part was that they seemed to already know I was there. Both were walking with steady steps, keeping some distance between each other, while the man on the porch continued watching without making any movement. At that moment, I felt a sharp knot in my stomach. I didn't know who those people were, but for the first time since stopping at that property, I had the clear feeling that I needed to leave immediately. I put the car into gear and started pulling out of the gravel driveway without taking my eyes off the mirrors. The two figures continued walking toward the road. They weren't running, but they also didn't seem to be casually wandering around the property. There was something very deliberate about the way they moved. When I reached the road, I looked quickly at the porch one more time. The man was still there, the same posture, the same arms at his sides, the same complete lack of reaction. That made me even more nervous than if he had been coming after me. I accelerated and continued down the road, trying to get away as quickly as possible. For several minutes, I kept checking the rearview mirror. The house disappeared behind a curve and I thought everything was over. But then I noticed something that made my heart start racing again. 2 points of light appeared in the distance behind me. Headlights. A vehicle had just entered the road. I hadn't seen any vehicle parked on the property when I stopped there. Yet now there was a vehicle traveling in the same direction as me. I tried to convince myself it could be a coincidence. It was a public road after all. Anyone could be using the same route. But as the minutes passed, the headlights remained behind me at exactly the same distance. When I accelerated, they accelerated. When I slowed down slightly for a curve, they slowed down too. I was becoming increasingly frightened. My phone still had no signal, and I had no idea where I was. At times, the road crossed completely open areas surrounded only by dark fields. At others, it passed through small wooded sections where tree branches cast strange shadows across the pavement. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my hands began to hurt. After about 10 minutes, I saw something that gave me a little hope. A sign indicating a state highway a few miles ahead. I continued driving in that direction while watching the headlights behind me. They were still there, neither closer nor farther away, just following. When I finally reached the state highway, I felt an enormous sense of relief. There was lighting at some intersections, proper signage, and for the first time in more than an hour, other vehicles on the road. As soon as I entered the highway, the headlights behind me slowed down. I watched in the rearview mirror as the vehicle remained stopped for a few seconds at the entrance to the rural road. Then it turned around and disappeared back in the direction it had come from. I couldn't identify the model or the license plate. The distance was too great, and the lighting wasn't helpful. Even so, I kept watching until the lights vanished completely. A few minutes later, my cell signal returned. My phone started receiving accumulated messages, and the GPS finally updated my correct location. I was much farther from my original route than I had realized. I called my relatives and explained that I had gotten lost. I didn't tell the whole story at that moment because I was still trying to understand what had happened. I just wanted to get to their house as quickly as possible. The next day, during the holiday lunch, I mentioned the incident to a cousin who had lived in that area for many years. When I described the road and the approximate location of the house, he became visibly uncomfortable. He asked several times if I was sure it was that property. Then he told me there had been old rumors about people using certain abandoned rural houses to lure lost drivers and commit thefts or robberies along secondary roads. He made it clear that he had never personally seen anything happen and that it could just be small-town gossip. Even so, he commented that many locals avoided stopping at isolated properties at night, especially those that appeared occupied but strangely empty. I was never able to confirm whether that house was one of those properties, or whether everything had simply been a series of frightening coincidences. What I do know is that the image of that man silently appearing on the porch remains very clear in my memory, and more than 5 years later, every time I see a single light on in an isolated house in the middle of nowhere, I remember that night and keep driving without stopping. Story 3. I was 26 years old when this happened, and I worked as a mechanic at an independent repair shop near Charleston, West Virginia. At the time, I did a little bit of everything: engine replacements, suspension work, brakes, electrical diagnostics. It was a small shop, and it was common for a customer to show up near closing time with an urgent problem. That night, I had stayed almost 3 hours past my normal shift because a work truck needed to be ready by the following morning. By the time I finally finished, it was already past 10 at night. I was tired, with the smell of oil still embedded in my hands even after washing them, and all I wanted was to get home. I lived alone in a rural area about 40 minutes from the shop. The drive involved several secondary roads that I knew almost by memory. I had been driving that route for years. There wasn't much traffic after dark, especially during the week. That night, a light rain was falling steadily. Not heavy enough to interfere with driving, but enough to make the pavement shine under the headlights and keep the windshield wipers working non-stop. The first 20 minutes of the drive were completely normal. The radio was on low, playing local news that I wasn't really paying attention to. The roads were empty. I don't remember passing more than 2 or 3 cars during that entire stretch. At one point along the route, the road passed through a more isolated area surrounded by woods on both sides. There were a few properties scattered around, but they were very far apart. I knew that area because I had grown up relatively close to it. I also knew there was an old bus stop near a long curve. It was just an old concrete structure with a rusted metal roof. Public transportation had stopped operating in that area many years earlier. That's why, when my headlights illuminated someone sitting in that shelter, I immediately thought it was strange. As I got closer, I could see a man sitting alone on the bench. He was motionless, leaning forward with his elbows resting on his knees. He was wearing a dark jacket and appeared to be looking at the ground. The rain continued falling around him. What caught my attention wasn't just the fact that he was there. It was that he showed absolutely no reaction when my vehicle passed. He didn't even raise his head. I kept driving, but that image stayed in my mind. It didn't make sense for someone to be waiting at a bus stop that hadn't seen a bus in years. I tried to come up with a simple explanation. Maybe his car had broken down. Maybe he was waiting for someone to pick him up. Maybe he was a local resident sheltering from the rain for some reason. Still, the more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. The shelter was far from any visible house. Besides that, it was late and cold. I looked in the rearview mirror a few times, but soon the curve and the darkness completely hid the bus stop. I tried to focus on the road again. The sound of the wipers moving across the windshield at regular intervals was practically the only thing I could hear. The heater was blowing warm air onto my feet, and the smell of moisture mixed with the lingering scent of the repair shop still filled the cab. A few miles later, out of habit, I looked into the rearview mirror again. That was when I felt immediate discomfort. There was a figure walking in the middle of the road behind my pickup truck. At first, I thought I was mistaking shadows for something real. I adjusted the mirror and looked more carefully. The figure was far away, but it was clearly a person, and it seemed to be wearing exactly the same type of dark jacket as the man I had seen at the bus stop. My first thought was that it was impossible. I had been driving for several minutes since passing the shelter. There was no way someone could have covered that distance on foot so quickly. Even so, the person remained visible in the mirror whenever the road straightened out. I started paying closer attention. At one point, I slowed down slightly to get a better look. The figure also seemed closer than it should have been. It wasn't running. It wasn't making gestures. It was simply walking. The rain made details difficult to see, but I had the unsettling feeling that it remained exactly in the center of the road. After a few more minutes, I reached a rural intersection where I had to stop before turning onto another road. As I slowed for the stop sign, something immediately caught my attention. The interior cab light came on for a moment. It took me a few seconds to understand why. When I looked back, I saw that the rear passenger side door was partially open. I immediately felt a chill in my stomach. My pickup was an extended cab, with a small space behind the front seats where I usually kept tools, parts, and some boxes from the shop. I was certain all the doors had been closed when I left work. More than that, the truck system would normally sound a warning if a door wasn't fully latched. During the entire drive, I hadn't heard anything. I sat at the intersection staring at the partially open door through the interior mirror. The cab light had already turned off again, but I could clearly see that the door wasn't fully closed. My heart started beating much faster. The first thing that crossed my mind was that someone might be hiding back there. I immediately looked through the center mirror, trying to see into the rear compartment, but the darkness inside the cab made it impossible. The rain continued hitting the roof, and the sound seemed much louder now. I didn't want to get out and check. Not there. Not on that empty road. While I was still trying to decide what to do, I glanced into the side mirror again and felt a shiver run down my spine. The figure walking along the road seemed closer than before. I couldn't tell exactly how far away it was, but it was definitely much nearer than when I had first noticed it. Without thinking twice, I accelerated and turned onto the secondary road. The truck responded immediately, and I began picking up speed. I kept checking the mirrors every few seconds. For several minutes, I didn't see anyone behind me anymore. Even so, the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't go away. My eyes alternated constantly between the road and the rear door reflected in the mirrors. At one point, I heard a sound coming from the back of the cab. It was very faint. Something like an object touching metal. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to put me completely on alert. I switched off the radio immediately. Now I could hear only the engine, the rain, and my own breathing. Then I heard another noise. This time it seemed to come directly from the compartment behind the passenger seat. I didn't know whether I was panicking or if someone was actually back there. The rational part of my mind told me that a toolbox had probably shifted during the drive. I carried a lot of equipment in the vehicle, and it wasn't unusual for something to slide around during turns or sudden stops. But the problem was that the sounds didn't resemble objects moving. They sounded like short, controlled movements, like someone trying not to make noise. I started feeling that rush of adrenaline that makes every little detail seem more intense. My hands became sweaty on the steering wheel. I kept my eyes fixed on the road, but I watched the reflection of the interior whenever I could. The space behind the seats was too dark to see clearly. The rain continued falling, and the trees on both sides of the road seemed to close in around me. I was about 15 minutes from home, but I had no intention of going there until I knew what was happening. If someone really was hiding in the truck, the last thing I wanted was to bring them to where I lived. A few miles later, I saw an opportunity. There was a 24-hour gas station near a state highway. It was a simple place, but there were always truck drivers and employees around during the night. As soon as I spotted the illuminated sign, I decided to head there. When I pulled into the parking lot, I drove straight to a brightly lit area near the main entrance of the convenience store. I parked the vehicle practically in front of the store windows. 2 people were fueling trucks, and an employee could be seen behind the register. For the first time since the intersection, I felt a little relief. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police if necessary, and quickly got out of the truck. The rain had eased considerably. I walked to the open rear door and pulled it completely open. My heart was pounding. I genuinely expected to find someone hiding there. But there was nobody. Just my tools, some boxes, and automotive parts scattered the way I usually left them. Even so, something was different. One of the plastic containers behind the seat had been opened, and inside it an item was missing that I was absolutely certain had been there when I left the shop. The missing item was a large flashlight that I used at the shop to work underneath vehicles. It wasn't valuable. It probably cost $20 or $30, but I used it almost every day and knew exactly where it was stored. I searched through the container several times to make sure I wasn't mistaken. I wasn't. It wasn't there. I also checked the floor of the cab, behind the seats, and even underneath them. Nothing. While doing that, I noticed something else. The inside handle of the rear door was wet. Not just damp from rain coming through the opening. It looked as though someone had recently grabbed it with wet hands. I stood there for several minutes trying to make sense of it. If someone had entered the truck at some point that night, when would it have happened? I hadn't stopped anywhere after leaving the shop. And even if I had, how could that person have gotten inside without me noticing? Eventually, I called the local police to report what had happened. An officer arrived about half an hour later, listened to my story, and inspected the vehicle. He found nobody, and also found no evidence sufficient to determine exactly what had happened. The official explanation was that perhaps the door hadn't closed properly, and that an item might have fallen out during the trip. But I knew that didn't explain everything. A few weeks later, during a conversation with a longtime customer who lived in that rural area, I mentioned the man I had seen sitting at the abandoned bus stop. Before I could even finish describing him, he asked if it was the shelter near the curve on the secondary road. When I confirmed it, he sighed and said that place had had a strange reputation for years. According to him, drivers occasionally reported seeing people at that stop during the early morning hours, even after the bus routes had ended. Some of those stories were probably exaggerations or small-town rumors. But one thing caught my attention. He mentioned that there had been reports of thefts from the vehicles of workers and truck drivers passing through the area at night. Nothing major. Tools, equipment, and items that were easy to carry. Maybe there is a simple explanation for everything. Maybe someone managed to open my door at some point without me noticing. Maybe the man at the bus stop was waiting for exactly that kind of opportunity. The problem is that to this day I still can't explain how that person appeared several miles behind my pickup truck, such a short time after I passed the shelter. It has been 4 years since that night. I still drive rural roads frequently because of my job, but every time I see an abandoned bus shelter after dark, I slow down and check twice to make sure all the doors are really locked. Story 4. This happened to me and my wife about 3 years ago when we were driving home from a wedding in rural Kansas. At the time, I was 31 and she was 29. The wedding was for one of her cousins who lived near a small town west of Wichita. The ceremony ended late because there was dinner, music, and a reception that lasted well past midnight. We had the option of staying at a hotel and driving back the next day, but we decided to head home that same night. It seemed like a good idea at the time. I had to work early on Monday and I preferred waking up in my own bed. My wife also wanted to avoid the extra expense. So we left a little after 1 in the morning. I was tired, but not exhausted. I hadn't been drinking because I was going to be the one driving home. The weather was pleasant for that time of year. The sky was clear, the temperature was cool, and there was very little traffic on the roads. As we moved farther away from town, the streetlights disappeared, and we returned to that typical rural Kansas landscape. Miles of dark fields, isolated farms, and long stretches of road with absolutely nobody around. The trip was going smoothly. My wife had taken off her shoes and was using her phone while I drove. The internet signal was already weak in several areas, so she alternated between listening to music and looking through some of the wedding photos. I remember commenting that it felt strange to see a road so empty. For several miles, we didn't pass a single vehicle, not coming from the opposite direction, not behind us. Just darkness on both sides and our headlights illuminating the pavement ahead. At one point, we took a secondary road that was commonly used as a shortcut to avoid a longer route to the main highway. I had driven there a few times before during the day, never at that hour of the night. Maybe 20 minutes after we entered that road, I started noticing something unusual ahead. At first, I thought they were shadows crossing the roadway. Then I realized there was movement. I immediately slowed down. When the headlights reached the area more clearly, we saw several cattle scattered across the road. Some were walking slowly on the pavement. Others were standing near the shoulder. There were enough animals to block almost the entire roadway. I slowed almost to a stop. The last thing I wanted was to hit an animal on that isolated road. Besides the danger to us, colliding with a cow that size could easily destroy the front of the car. The headlights illuminated the animals spread across the roadway as they wandered around without any urgency. Some looked directly at the vehicle. Others kept crossing toward the other side of the fence. My wife lowered her phone and started watching the situation too. She was the first to notice where the animals were coming from. A few yards ahead, there was an open gate. We could see it because it partially reflected the headlights. It looked as though someone had left the passage open, allowing the cattle to leave the pasture. At the time, I thought that explained everything. Farmers make mistakes, fences break, animals escape. It was inconvenient, but it didn't seem like anything more than that. I waited for the cattle to clear enough space for us to slowly drive through them. While watching the animals, I noticed something near the fence. At first, I thought it was just a post or some piece of farm equipment standing near the gate. But as the headlights illuminated the area more clearly, I realized it was a person. A man was standing beside the fence looking directly at our car. He wasn't making any effort to gather the cattle. He wasn't carrying a flashlight. He didn't seem concerned that dozens of cattle were spread across the road. He was simply watching. My wife saw him almost at the same moment. I remember her asking something like, "Do you know that guy?" Because the situation seemed far too strange. I shook my head and kept staring. The man was wearing dark clothes and a cap. The distance made it difficult to see his face, but it was clear that he was facing us. What bothered me was his complete lack of reaction. If those animals really belonged to him or to a nearby farmer, I would have expected him to be trying to solve the problem. Instead, he remained motionless, simply watching. I was still trying to make sense of the situation when I heard my wife say my name in a tone that immediately put me on alert. It wasn't a scream. It was worse. It was that kind of quiet voice someone uses when they're frightened and don't want to attract attention. I glanced at her and noticed she was staring into the passenger side mirror. When I followed her gaze, I felt an immediate knot in my stomach. There was another person behind our car. I had no idea where he had come from. Just seconds earlier, I had checked the mirrors while slowing down, and the road had been completely empty. Now a man was walking slowly along the shoulder, approaching the rear of the vehicle. Our headlights didn't illuminate that area very well, but his silhouette was clearly visible. He was also wearing dark clothing. The worst part was that he seemed to be looking directly at us. Not at the cattle, not at the road, at the car. At that moment, something finally clicked in my mind. The open gate, the cattle spread across the road blocking traffic, the man standing by the fence, and now another one appearing behind the vehicle. Together, it started looking less like an accident and more like a situation created on purpose. I remember looking back at the man by the fence. He was still standing exactly where he had been. No gestures, no attempt to speak to us, no explanation. My wife asked if we should reverse. I checked the rearview mirror. The man behind the car was still approaching. He wasn't running, but he was steadily closing the distance. I could feel the adrenaline taking over. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Then I noticed another detail. More movement near the gate. There was at least one additional figure partially hidden behind the fence. I couldn't see the person completely, but I could make out someone moving in the darkness. At that instant, I stopped seeing the cattle as the problem and started seeing them as an obstacle deliberately placed where we would be forced to stop. I made a decision almost on instinct. Instead of continuing to wait for the animals to move out of the way, I searched for a narrow gap between two cattle standing closer to the left shoulder. It wasn't a comfortable path. There was a risk of spooking the animals or even hitting one of them. But at that moment, it seemed far less dangerous than remaining stopped. I put the car in gear and moved forward slowly. Some of the cattle stepped aside when they heard the engine approaching. Others remained motionless until the last second. My wife nervously watched the mirrors while I tried to keep the vehicle within the available space. When we started passing through the animals, I heard a shout for the first time that night. It came from the direction of the fence. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like someone trying to get our attention. I didn't stop to find out. I kept moving while the car bounced slightly over the uneven shoulder. When we finally cleared the main group of cattle, I accelerated immediately. For the first few seconds, I couldn't stop watching the mirrors. The man who had been standing by the fence had started running. Not toward the cattle, toward the road. Another man had also appeared near the gate. The distance between us was increasing rapidly because I was already accelerating, but it was enough to confirm that something was wrong. My wife saw it too. She kept looking behind us while repeating that we needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. I completely agreed. The problem was that the road remained isolated. There were no nearby houses, gas stations, or busy places, just dark fields on both sides. I kept accelerating until I reached a speed I normally wouldn't have used on that stretch of road. My heart was still pounding. A few minutes later, I looked into the rearview mirror again and saw headlights appearing behind us. At that moment, I thought it was the same men following our car. The feeling of fear returned immediately. The headlights remained behind us for several minutes, and I became convinced we were being followed. I kept accelerating whenever the road allowed it. My wife even grabbed her phone to try calling the police, but the signal in that area was practically non-existent. At times, one bar would appear and disappear again almost immediately. I constantly checked the mirrors while driving. As the minutes passed, the headlights began getting closer. I was already preparing to pull into any illuminated property we found along the way when we finally managed to get a better look at the vehicle. It was a county sheriff's pickup truck. I had never felt so relieved to see emergency lights activated behind me. I immediately pulled onto the shoulder. The officer approached the window, and the first thing he asked was why I had been driving so fast on that road. Before he could even finish the question, we started explaining everything that had happened. The open gate, the cattle, the men near the fence, and the feeling that someone had been trying to force us to stop. The officer listened carefully and then asked for the exact location. He knew the area and seemed to take the report seriously. He said there had been some incidents involving thefts and suspicious encounters on isolated rural roads, although he couldn't confirm that this was the same situation. Another patrol unit was sent to check the area while we remained parked there. Later, we were informed that they found the gate open and some of the cattle still near the road, but they didn't locate anyone nearby. None of the men we had seen were there when the officers arrived. Maybe they fled as soon as they realized they hadn't managed to stop us. Maybe we'll never know exactly what their plan was. What I do know is that the situation didn't feel accidental. None of the men tried to help gather the cattle. None asked for assistance. None seemed concerned about the danger it posed to drivers. Several years have passed since that night, but I still think about it whenever I travel through rural areas after dark. Before that incident, an open gate and a few animals on the road seemed like nothing more than an inconvenience. Today, whenever I see something blocking an isolated road after midnight, the first thing I ask myself is whether it really happened by chance. Story 5. I was 42 years old when this happened, and I worked on my family's farm near North Platte, Nebraska. We grew corn and soybeans across several properties throughout the region, so during harvest season it was normal to spend entire nights driving from one field to another. Anyone who has worked in agriculture knows what those weeks are like. You sleep very little, spend hours inside trucks and tractors, and end up knowing every dirt road in the area better than you know the streets of your own town. At that time, I was responsible for transporting part of the harvest from the fields to the storage silos. That meant driving constantly throughout the night. On the night everything happened, I was alone in a medium-duty farm truck. The weather was dry, the temperature pleasant for autumn, and the sky completely clear. As always, I had a two-way radio installed in the cab to communicate with other employees spread across the different properties. It was a simple frequency used only by the farm crew. Nothing sophisticated. Most of the transmissions consisted of work-related information, equipment locations, and requests for assistance when a machine broke down. Around 10 o'clock that night, I was returning from a relatively distant harvesting area. The road was a dirt road, surrounded by dark fields on both sides and practically no lighting other than my own headlights. I remember talking over the radio with an employee named Travis about how many trucks would still need to make trips that night. The transmission was normal. There was a little static, as there always was in more remote areas, but nothing unusual. Then his voice simply disappeared in the middle of the conversation. I assumed I had temporarily lost signal. That happened sometimes. But shortly afterward, another voice came over the frequency. It was a calm male voice speaking very clearly. At first, I thought it was someone accidentally using a similar radio. However, the first sentence immediately caught my attention. The man said that the red pickup truck parked near the barn on the Miller farm still had its headlights on. The detail was that I had passed that exact property less than 10 minutes earlier, and there really was a red pickup parked near a barn. That was far too specific to be a coincidence. At first, I still tried to find a simple explanation. Maybe it was another farmer in the area using a nearby frequency. Maybe someone was playing a prank. I picked up the microphone and asked who was speaking. I didn't get an immediate response. There were only a few seconds of static. Then the same voice returned. This time it said something that truly got my attention. The man described the truck I was driving, not just the model. He mentioned the white cargo bed covered in harvest dust and the agricultural cooperative sticker on the driver's door. I immediately looked around through the cab windows. There were no other vehicles visible on the road, nothing behind me. Nothing coming from the opposite direction, just dark fields illuminated by my headlights. I asked again who he was, but the voice completely ignored the question. Instead, it commented that I was driving down a dirt road with a harvested cornfield on my right and an irrigation system sitting idle on my left. I looked to both sides of the road and felt immediate discomfort. That was exactly the scene surrounding me at that moment. From that point on, the situation became genuinely strange. For several minutes, the voice continued appearing at irregular intervals. It didn't sound threatening. It didn't shout. It didn't make jokes. It spoke almost like someone describing a scene to another person. At one point, it commented that I was wearing a brown jacket over a gray t-shirt. I looked down at myself and felt a chill. That was exactly what I was wearing. The only way someone could have known that was by observing me closely. I remember feeling my stomach tighten as I repeatedly checked the mirrors. The road remained empty. No distant lights. No vehicle hidden behind me. Nothing. I even considered that someone might be using binoculars from a nearby property, but that didn't make sense either. The comments were updated as I continued driving, as if the person were tracking my movements in real time. When the voice mentioned that I had just picked up a bottle of water from the cup holder beside my seat, I decided I had heard enough. I turned the radio off completely. For several minutes, I tried to convince myself that I had done the right thing. With the radio off, at least I no longer had to listen to that voice. Even so, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. The silence inside the cab started to feel strange. I could hear only the truck engine, the sound of the tires kicking up dust from the road, and the slight rattling of the cargo in the bed. I kept checking the mirrors constantly, expecting to find some obvious explanation for everything. Maybe a vehicle hiding without headlights. Maybe someone following me from a distance. But the road remained completely empty. I knew that area very well. I knew where the houses, barns, and access roads to other properties were located. Along most of that route, there was practically nothing except fields. About 15 minutes after turning off the radio, I approached a rural intersection where I needed to turn right toward the farm silos. That was when I noticed something parked at a side entrance a short distance ahead. At first glance, it looked like a dark pickup truck parked beside the road. As I got closer, my headlights illuminated the vehicle more clearly. It was an older pickup, probably a work model. What immediately caught my attention was the absence of license plates, neither on the front nor the back. The vehicle was turned off and partially hidden near an access point used by farm equipment. I instinctively slowed down. Not because I intended to stop, but because I wanted a better look. The interior of the truck was too dark to tell whether anyone was inside. The problem was its location. That entrance was positioned exactly where I needed to make my turn. I would have to pass very close to it. As I approached, I felt the same discomfort that had begun with the voice on the radio. The impression that someone already knew exactly which route I would take. When my headlights fully illuminated the pickup truck, I noticed movement inside the cab. Someone was sitting behind the steering wheel, and they appeared to be looking directly at me. At that moment, I seriously began considering that everything was connected. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe that pickup had nothing to do with the voice on the radio. But after everything that had happened, it was difficult to believe in coincidences. I kept moving without slowing down any further. As I approached the intersection, I was able to make out the person inside the cab a little more clearly. It was only a dark silhouette. I couldn't determine age, appearance, or any facial details. All I could tell was that the person remained motionless, facing the road, facing me. I passed the side entrance and turned right without stopping. For several seconds, I kept shifting my gaze between the road and the rearview mirror. The pickup truck remained stationary. Then, almost immediately after I completed the turn, its headlights came on. My stomach dropped instantly. A few seconds later, the vehicle pulled onto the road behind me. I knew the farm silos were less than 10 minutes away. I also knew there would be other people working there. If I could get there, I wouldn't be alone anymore. The problem was making it through those 10 minutes. The pickup remained behind my truck at a constant distance. It didn't try to pass, it didn't get too close, it simply followed. I couldn't see a license plate because there wasn't one, and the glare from its own headlights made it difficult to see who was driving. My breathing became heavier as I constantly checked the mirrors. At one point, I grabbed my phone to call one of the silo operators, but the signal in that area was practically non-existent. The call wouldn't go through. I kept driving. The closer I got to the property, the more convinced I became that someone was deliberately following me. Then I saw the first lights of the silos appear on the horizon. I had never been so happy to see industrial floodlights. As soon as the silo lights became closer, I noticed an immediate change in the pickup truck's behavior. It started slowing down. I kept driving without reducing my speed. There were at least 5 employees working in that area that night, along with other trucks constantly coming and going. When I finally reached the main entrance to the property, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw that the vehicle had stopped on the road. It remained motionless for a few seconds. Then it slowly turned around and disappeared in the opposite direction. I pulled into the silo yard feeling a mixture of relief and confusion. I parked the truck, climbed down from the cab, and immediately went to find the other workers. I told them the entire story while the load was being unloaded. Some thought someone was trying to play a prank. Others didn't seem so convinced. One of the older operators commented that he had heard reports of people using high-powered radios to monitor rural workers in isolated areas, especially during harvest season, when there was constant movement of vehicles and equipment. Later that same night, we checked the frequency used by the farm. No similar transmission ever appeared again. In the following days, there were no additional incidents either. Even so, a few things still bother me when I think back on that story. The person on the radio didn't just describe the truck or the road. They mentioned details that required a very close view inside the cab. And the pickup truck without license plates appeared at the exact access point I needed to use to reach the silos. Maybe it was someone monitoring workers in the area for some reason. Maybe they were looking for an opportunity to steal equipment, fuel, or cargo. We never found out. What I do know is that after that night, the farm changed some of its communication frequencies and began instructing employees never to drive alone in more isolated areas during the early morning hours whenever it could be avoided. Several years have passed since then. I still work in agriculture and continue using a radio almost every day, but whenever an unfamiliar voice appears on a frequency that is supposed to be restricted to the crew, I feel the same chill in my stomach that I felt on that dirt road in the middle of harvest season. Story 6. I was 27 years old when this happened, and I was moving to a small town in rural Iowa to start my first full-time teaching job. I had graduated only a few months earlier and had secured a position at a public school near a relatively small farming community. I was excited about the opportunity, but also nervous. I had never lived so far away from my family. That weekend, I was driving alone from Des Moines to the town where I would be living. My car was packed with boxes, clothes, books, and practically everything I owned. The move had taken longer than I expected, and by the time I finally got on the road, it was already late afternoon. I thought I would arrive before dark, but a combination of traffic, fuel stops, and a few detours ended up delaying everything. By the time I reached the final stage of the trip, it was already nighttime. I was driving along rural roads surrounded by farms and fields that seemed to stretch on forever. The GPS was still working, but the cell signal was beginning to fluctuate in some of the more remote areas. I was tired, but focused only on getting to my new home. Around 9 o'clock that night, I noticed the car beginning to behave strangely. First, a warning light appeared on the dashboard. Then the engine seemed to lose power during acceleration. I didn't know anything about mechanics, so I kept driving, hoping I could make it to my destination. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. A few miles later, the car began to struggle more noticeably. The engine sputtered, responded poorly to the accelerator, and produced an uneven sound I had never heard before. Eventually, it lost almost all power. I managed to steer it onto the shoulder of a dirt road before it died completely. I tried starting it several times, but nothing happened besides a few weak noises. I grabbed my phone to call for help and discovered I had no signal. I remember feeling a mix of frustration and concern. I didn't know anyone in that area. It was nighttime and I was stranded on a practically deserted road. That was when I saw a light in the distance. At the end of that dirt road stood a large barn partially illuminated by exterior floodlights. It looked like an active occupied property. At that moment, it seemed like my best chance of finding help. I grabbed a small flashlight that I kept in the glove compartment and started walking down the dirt road toward the barn. The night was cool, and a steady wind moved through the surrounding fields. As I got closer, I began to find the property a little strange. From a distance, it had looked active. There were lights on in several places, and I could clearly see the main structure of the barn illuminated against the darkness. But the closer I got, the more I noticed the absence of sounds. I couldn't hear tractors, I couldn't hear radios, I couldn't hear conversations, not even dogs barking. It was an unusual silence for a place that appeared occupied. I kept walking because I didn't have many options. When I reached the area near the barn, I called out several times to see if anyone would answer. Nothing. I walked around the building looking for a main house or any sign of residence. There were some lights on inside the barn, but the doors were closed. The place looked as though it had been used recently, yet there wasn't a single visible person nearby. I decided to go around the barn in search of another entrance or perhaps a residence behind the property. That was when I found something that immediately made me uncomfortable. There were several vehicles parked behind the structure. At least 6 or 7. Pickup trucks, SUVs, and a work truck. The strange detail was that they were positioned in a partially concealed area far from the main road. That already seemed unusual by itself, but what truly caught my attention was the fact that some of the engines were still warm. I'm not a mechanic, but anyone can tell when a vehicle has been used recently. One of the pickups was making that characteristic metallic ticking sound of a cooling engine. Another had a slightly warm hood when I accidentally brushed against it while passing by. Those vehicles weren't abandoned. Someone had arrived there not long before, and yet I still hadn't seen a single person. I started feeling as though I shouldn't be there. My intention became returning to my car and finding another solution in the morning. It was exactly when I started heading back along the side of the barn that I heard voices. At first, I heard only fragments of conversation. Male voices coming from somewhere on the opposite side of the barn. They were close enough for me to tell that there was more than one person, but not close enough to understand exactly what they were saying. I stopped immediately. My first reaction was relief. After all, I had been looking for help. But that feeling lasted only a few seconds. As I listened more carefully, I noticed a change in the tone of the voices. Someone seemed to have noticed something. There was a pause in the conversation. Then I heard a question that I couldn't fully understand. After that came footsteps, lots of footsteps. My stomach dropped immediately. I still hadn't introduced myself, hadn't called out to anyone, and hadn't made enough noise to justify that reaction. I stood motionless for a few seconds, trying to decide what to do. Then I heard another voice say something that sounded very close to, "Who's there?" It didn't sound like a friendly question. It sounded like a demand. At that moment, I had the very clear feeling that those people were not expecting visitors. I immediately turned around and started walking back the way I had come. I tried not to run so I wouldn't attract more attention, but I could already hear movement behind the barn. More voices, more footsteps. When I risked looking over my shoulder, I saw lights appearing on the other side of the building. Flashlights. At least 2, maybe 3. I couldn't tell exactly how many people were there. I only knew they were moving in my direction. That was when I abandoned any attempt to remain calm. I started running. The flashlight in my hand bounced as I crossed the dirt area behind the barn. I heard someone shout again, this time more loudly. I couldn't understand the words. The only thing that mattered was getting back to my car. My heart was racing, and I felt that horrible sense of vulnerability that comes from being completely alone on an unfamiliar property in the middle of the night. When I reached the side of the barn, I heard a metal door slam behind me and became certain that more people had just come outside. I ran as fast as I could down the dirt road. I could hear my own footsteps mixed with the sound of my heavy breathing and the wind sweeping across the fields. Behind me, the voices continued. At times, I could hear people talking to one another. At others, only the sound of footsteps on dirt and gravel. I didn't know how many there were, and I didn't want to find out. The distance back to my car felt much longer than it had when I walked toward the barn. Several times I looked over my shoulder and saw flashlight beams moving near the structure. It didn't seem like they were running directly after me, but they also didn't seem interested in letting me leave without finding out who I was. When I finally spotted my car parked on the shoulder, I felt a brief sense of relief. I ran to the driver's door, got inside, and immediately tried to start the engine again. The result was the same as before. Just a few clicks and nothing else. I tried again and again, nothing. That was the moment when fear truly took over. I was sitting inside a broken-down car alone without cell service, and only minutes away from a property where several people now knew I was there. I immediately turned off the interior light and lowered myself slightly in the seat. The road remained dark. For a few seconds, I didn't see anyone. Then the first flashlight beams appeared in the distance. They moved near the barn and then began advancing down the road. My heart felt like it wanted to burst out of my chest. I didn't know who those people were or why they had reacted that way to the presence of a stranger. Maybe they were simply protecting private property. Maybe it was something completely innocent. But at that moment, I had no way of knowing. I kept trying to start the car while watching the lights slowly approach. On the fourth or fifth attempt, the engine finally responded. First with a sputter, then another. And then it came back to life, running unevenly. I had never been so happy to hear an engine running. The moment the engine started, I put the car into motion without wasting a second. I didn't even worry about whether it was running properly. I just wanted to get out of there. The vehicle still stumbled occasionally, but at least it was moving. As I accelerated down the dirt road, I quickly glanced into the rearview mirror. I could see several flashlight beams scattered around the spot where my car had been parked moments earlier. There was definitely more than one person. Some appeared to be watching the road. Others remained grouped together. No vehicle left the property to follow me, but I kept driving as though it could happen at any moment. A few minutes later, I reached a busier state highway. Almost immediately, I regained cell service. I pulled into an open gas station and called a roadside assistance service. Only then did I realize how badly I was shaking. My hands could barely hold the phone. I stayed inside the convenience store until the tow truck arrived because I didn't want to be alone outside. In the days that followed, I thought a lot about what had happened. Maybe those people were simply gathered there for some private reason and reacted suspiciously when they noticed a stranger walking around the property at night. That would be a perfectly reasonable explanation. But some things still bother me. If it was just an ordinary gathering, why were so many vehicles hidden behind the barn instead of parked near the entrance? Why did the place seem occupied but completely silent until I got close? And most importantly, why was the immediate reaction to search for whoever was there instead of simply responding when I asked for help? A few weeks later, I spoke with a colleague at the school who had grown up in that area. When I mentioned the approximate location of the property, he advised me to avoid certain isolated rural areas at night and quickly changed the subject. I never discovered what was really happening in that barn. Maybe it wasn't anything illegal. Maybe it was simply a gathering that didn't want unexpected visitors. But even today, when I remember the flashlights appearing in the darkness and the voices realizing that I was alone on that road, I am certain of one thing. I was not a visitor they had expected to find that night.
Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.